Steve and I had been jabbed and scratched at the heels until we were standing in a vast chamber. Along the way, we'd been joined by a few more pairs of prisoners from the other cells within the purple hieroglyph-lined maze. In the end, there was a group of 8 of us, all shackled, naked, and, with exception of Steve, terrified. The chamber we were taken to had such a high ceiling that the sockets from which the glowing purple orb dangled were lost in the shadow. I realized that the piss and shit water smell was completely gone here. In fact, the air had no scent at all really, to the point that the lack of nasal stimulation was both immediately noticeable and deeply concerning. Replacing smells and scents was a strange sensation that I struggled to put into words, like if electricity had an odor, one that scorched your nostrils and thinned your blood. In terms of floor space, the chamber was the size of a football field, although most of this was taken up by the colossal obelisk in the room's center. This behemoth construction stood in the middle of a circle of 6 thick stone pillars that ran from the marble mosaic floor until they too were lost in the darkness above. The ornate columns were lined with more hieroglyphs, although these were much more intricate than those on the walls of the tunnels the lizards had marched us through. The ring of columns was some way away, so I couldn't really pick out many details of these new carvings. I wasn't paying them too much attention though, just being honest. I was far too awestruck by the towering construct the circle of pillars contained. The obelisk was a vast, irregular pyramid whose tips stopped just short of becoming lost in ceiling shadow. Save for an empty section about halfway up its face, it appeared to be constructed entirely from the same mottled, bluish, pearlescent metal as the lizard's sickle-tipped spears. The same ones that left a mess of cuts and scratches on my calves and ankles from our march through the tunnels. There were intricate circular patterns carved across every inch of the azure steel, and at various points some of these circles were hollowed out to allow thick messes of cable to plummet from the hidden interior of the obelisk. These cables, some as thick as a drain pipe, dangled and trailed off into the banks of flashing and beeping machines lining the walls. There were more lizards here, the jaundiced frog-looking ones. They tended the thick cables and whirring machines. Hundreds of bulging pairs of green eyes throwing disdainful gazes our way every time one of us would whimper or plead. There were a few of the besashed guard types too, although not as many as I'd have thought given the obvious significance of the chamber and the obelisk it contained. It was the hollowed-out middle of the obelisk which drew the most attention, however. When I caught sight of the car-sized glowing chunk of crystal suspended from bone, flesh, and sinew within the hole in the metal, my jaw dropped. It stayed dropped as I gazed, dumbstruck, at the dancing light across its surface. It was a color I've never seen, somehow orange and blue at the same time. I know that doesn't explain it all, either, but you try describing an entirely new color though. It's hard. We don't have the language. That's why I couldn't stop staring at the fucking thing. Even though the crystalline lump was clearly mineral, it was beating almost imperceptibly in its fleshy bindings. As I stared, I realized this was where the electric scent was emanating from. As the coppery buzzing in my nostrils got more intense the longer I looked, aside from the hollowed-out section containing the glowing, beating shard of blue-orange crystal, the only other feature of the obelisk was a distressingly not lizard-sized chair. I gulped when I saw this, my mind flashing back to the circular boreholes and burned-out skulls of the corpses in the fatberg. There were 2 more pillars on either side of the chamber entrance, and it was to these that Steve, myself, and the rest of the lizard's captives were hooked by the chains around our ankles. A new sound then entered the room, audible even above the muffled whimpers and sobs of us captives. It was squeaking, a slow, echoing squeak like a shopping trolley wheel in need of oiling, or... I blinked. The whimpers and sobs around me either died outright or transformed into confused mutters. Is that a television? Steve was right. It was a TV. One of those old boxy TVs with a glass screen that teachers used to wheel in when we couldn't be bothered to do any actual teaching. Two of the frog lizards had pulled out from behind one of the unfamiliar beeping flashing machines around the obelisk. Another walked behind them, carrying an extension cord and VHS tape. There was some untranslatable dialogue between the frog lizards and our sickle spear wielding guards. Then one of the fat yellow reptiles pushed the VHS into the slot of the player. There was a ping, followed by a white dot appearing at the center of the screen. Audio too swam into my sensory range. The familiar faint hums and crackles I remembered from watching Disney and Star Wars tapes in my youth. The dot hovered in the middle of the glass for a few seconds before ballooning outward to fill the screen with a crackling, static, tattered white background. A tinny, synthy jingle played as a single word rolled across the screen. Ipset. I turned to meet Steve's gaze. He shrugged at me from the other entrance pillar, letting me know the word Ipset meant as little to him as it did to myself. We knew it was human in origin, though. Ipset in the VHS tape, I mean. We knew because as soon as the short polyphonic jingle finished, the screen wiped to a small Indian or possibly Pakistani-looking bloke sat on a large leather chair in front of a stately fireplace. "Ah, hello, I didn't see you there," he said, smiling over his circular glasses into the camera. "My name is Dr. Anand, but you can call me Depeche if that makes your transition easier." From across the entranceway, I could see that Steve looked as confused as I felt. I heard someone mutter, "What the fuck?" to my left, and to my right a woman was sobbing, "No, they're gonna make me a lab rat, they're gonna probe me." I understood her fear. The lab coat Depeche was wearing, not to mention his doctor status, was doing a heck of a lot to ensure the terror I was shaken to my core by wasn't disrupted by the confusion caused by an out-of-place television. Oblivious to the concerns of his audience, Depeche continued to spiel as the tape played on. "If you're watching this, it means you've been handpicked by the Githerians to power the Great Cage. You're probably worried. Don't be. The only reason you were kidnapped is that we need to keep all of this super secret. This is so super secret that I don't even have clearance to know where you're watching this from. All the researchers and security we assigned to aid the Githerians are on duty until death, just so they can't accidentally give up the location. How crazy is that?" Photographs appeared next to Depeche's head as he spoke. Photos of the chamber we were shackled to pillars in. It looked different, though. In the images, there were humans, smiling men and women in lab coats stood amongst the jaundiced frog lizards. Pictures of security guards with submachine guns grinning while they kneeled down next to yellow-sashed reptilians danced in front of our eyes, and though I looked around for one of these human guards hoping I could somehow plead or bargain with one, there were none to be found. The only human beings were the naked, bleeding, terrified ones shackled to the pillars. Well, terrified with the exception of Steve, of course. Crazy bastard. When the quick slideshow on the video finished, Depeche continued chatting to us in his sing-song voice. "Now, you're probably wondering how you're going to contribute. That's a good question. Well, our friends the Githerians have been protecting the planet from an extraterrestrial being called Entity 3, or Joof to you, for billions of years, long before we humans ever walked the Earth. I know. Impressive, right?" My head was swimming. I was trying to understand what Depeche was telling me, genuinely. I was. I couldn't comprehend it. My mind wouldn't let me. My sanity wasn't robust enough to accept this. There wasn't a race of ancient civilized reptiles that walked the Earth before humans. I knew that such things didn't exist, yet despite my mind's insistence that they were impossible, they'd captured me anyway. I wasn't even going to begin to try and wrap my head around the other stuff. Let's deal with the lizards before we start trying to rationalize the fact that Depeche casually dropped the fact that extraterrestrial beings, aka goddamn fucking aliens, exist on us. As for Depeche, His smiling face in the video clearly had no cares for our quickly fracturing psyches. He continued on, grinning away as if he were recording a bit on the letter A for Sesame Street. You need to spend several decades studying paranatural theology to truly understand Juf. But who has time for that, right? To give you the shorthand version, Juf is an alien god. I know, scary stuff, but don't you worry, friend. Thanks to the ingenuity of the Gatherians and your heroic efforts, Juf will never be free. Because trust me, none of us want that. Hold on, I thought... Did he say heroic efforts? No, man. No heroic efforts here. Not from Rob Sullivan. Heroic efforts was dangerously close to sacrifice in my book. My knees were wobbling again. Weak. I didn't know where Depeche was going with the speech, but I could already tell the destination was nowhere good. Juf traveled here on a meteor billions of years ago. Before we came along, the Gatherians would have to connect dinosaurs, mammals, and each other to keep Juf imprisoned. Not convenient at all, right? Hooking up a T-Rex to the Great Cage must have been tricky when you're that tiny. Aha! Thankfully, when we came along, everything changed. Inside you, yes, you watching this right now, is a battery of highly potent paranatural energy. Here at IPSET, we refer to it as essence, but you can call it a soul or a spirit if that makes life easier. Are you ready to feel special, friend? Well, of all the beings in this universe, we humans have the most essence. That's right, friend. You're a tiny, tiny battery full of potential for utility. I felt the color drain from my face. This part of Depeche's ramblings I understood. I'd seen the fucking Matrix, after all. I collapsed onto the floor, whimpering, as did a few others who'd clearly had the penny drop. That's where the Great Cage comes in. Since we emerged from our caves, the Gatherians have found powering the Great Cage way easier. Just one human gives the same power as a whole herd of Brontosaurus, or an entire Gatherian colony. Isn't science wonderful? That's where we come in, because we here at IPSET would prefer not to lose the Earth to an extraterrestrial deity. We've been helping the Gatherians refine the process and keep things under wraps. Don't you worry. Your suicide note is already in the mail to your family. Steve started yelling at this point, thrashing against his chains. He only stopped when one of the yellow-sashed guards thrust a sickle-tipped spear his way, hovering it above his throat. I didn't have a family, really. My old mom died yonks back, and I'd never really settled with a missus. Steve was different, though. Steve had a kid. Fuck, Steve had a kid. Who's gonna tell Heather? No, I can't think about that now. It's way out of my control. If that ambulance doesn't get here soon, too, I think I'm gonna have much bigger problems. In case you're wondering, no, I didn't get this gash on my chest because the lizards tried to turn me into a battery. I didn't even get it from the lizards. I'm going to get to that, though, to those things in a minute. I've got to tell you how Steve died first. Back then, Depeche continued despite Steve's brief commotion. Now, as far for you, you've got some very specific instructions. Once your body is connected, your essence will be transferred into the Great Cage battery. Don't worry about your physical form. The Gatherians will dispose of that on your behalf. To make your transition from matter to energy-based life easier, we've created a computer simulation that will create physical representations of you, your new home, the Great Cage, and Juf. Sorry we couldn't make things more presentable. We were a little pressed for time. Also, please ignore the body of Dr. Billings in the corner. He was one of the researchers that programmed the simulation and, well, after he died inside the original, his body seemed to get copied across the duplicates. We're working on it, but for now, please do accept our sincerest apologies. We were all yelling now, shouting at our captor, screaming profanity or pleading for release. The cartoon illustrations Depeche had spoken over made it very clear what his words meant. The panic those images caused. The mob terror inspired by the sequential explanation of having our souls ripped from our bodies was palpable. Even Steve was caught up in it. He was screaming and crying along with the rest of us, pulling at the hook holding his chains onto the pillar. Inside the great cage, you'll find a computer connected to a glass case. It's imperative that you do not smash the glass. One of the lizards had turned the volume on the television up, muttering to itself as it did, so Depeche could still be heard. You can use the computer to send messages from the great cage to IPSET database, and we'll try to assist whenever and wherever we can. You never know. We may figure out how to help one day. Sooner or later, though, you will smash the glass. Juf is crafty and he has lots of tricks, and you're only human. Don't worry, this is all part of the plan. Why do you think the great cage needs a steady supply of involunteers like you? The yellow-sashed lizards had clearly had enough at this point. Two of them grabbed the woman next to me. She screamed, flailing and kicking against their thick, oil-slick scales. It did no good. They didn't flinch, budge, even register her resistance as they pulled and prodded her along with their sick-tipped spears. We all knew where they were taking her. The chair. The horrifyingly human-sized chair. The one connected by thick wires to the flesh and metal obelisk, and by extension the glowing rock it held captive. So remember, Depeche continued, his cheery tones projecting over the woman's screams. Once you're part of the great cage, hold off from smashing the glass as long as possible. We're not sure what will happen to you when you do, but we imagine it's not pleasant. Best to hold out as long as possible, huh? However, rest assured that the only freedom Juf will find when he escapes your layer of the cage is the confines of the glass case in another layer of the cage. That's why we need so many of you. The lizard guards had bolted the crying, naked woman to the chair. From behind one of the beeping machines at its base, two of the frog lizards emerged. They were carrying another thick table. At its tip was a blue metal instrument, a three-pronged claw with a hand crate jutting out to one side. There was a hollow cylinder suspended between the three prongs, the edges of which were razor-thinned and serrated. So go on now, and prepare for your existence to have new meaning, friend. You have been chosen to have something most do not. Purpose. Remember, just because you're insignificant doesn't mean your death has to be. The woman's cries didn't stop while the yellow-sashed reptilian guards scampered up the side of the stone chair to hold her head still. The tears continued flowing freely when the fat yellow ones followed and used the prongs to position the device on her forehead. My own tears started when one of the jaundiced frog lizards started turning the hand crank. If I do survive tonight, I hope I can get the sound of that first wet, squelching crack out of my head. Something tells me I won't, though. It was audible even over the beeping machines and sobbing captives, the unmistakable crunching of steel grinding through skin, muscle, and bone. When the woman's eyes slowly rose and saw the loose disc of bone hanging by a thread of skin from her forehead, left in place after the crank-operating lizard had reversed the tree-panning tool with a quick reverse spin of the lever, she howled. Not screamed, not wailed, howled. Like a fucking beast. Like a cornered animal. I didn't know people could make sounds that primal. The only mercy was that she wasn't conscious enough to process the reality of feeling air on her exposed brain for long. Something shot from the center of the retracted drill cylinder. Something fleshy, purple, and writhing. It attached itself to the gaping hole on the woman's forehead. In a moment, she stopped screaming, and at a moment later, the rest of us started. You ever seen a film where someone gets the electric chair? You know, where they're all shaking and spasming, rocking like one-man earthquake from all the volts going through them? This was nothing like that. There was no shaking, no tremors or twitches. First was her jaw. It jutted out so far I thought the damn thing was gonna fall off. Her nostrils flared, eyes rolled back into her skull so far small rivulets of blood trickled from the corners of her eyelids. Then they came from her ears, then her nostrils. Then the veins across her entire body pulsed and bubbled under her skin. Then the blood from her nose, ears, and eyes was bubbling too, and the steam was pouring from her ears. I screamed louder than I ever have done as I watched the flesh of her eyeballs bubble and blister. The skin where her boiling blood fell crackling and spitting. This continued for a full 5 minutes, when without warning, she fell still. For a second there was silence. Then from the center of the obelisk, a long, low rumbling emerged. It started small, quickly rising into an angry crescendo that shook loose a light rain of dust from the hidden ceiling so far above us. The machines lining the walls wheezed and blipped louder than they ever had. The cable attached to the woman glowed brilliant red, the organic purple appendage connecting it to her forehead writhing and bulging. The air was permeated by a strange sucking sound, sort of organic but at the same time tinged with undertones of, for a lack of a better word, lightning. Once the cable sucker was satisfied, it retracted back into the blue steel implement. The red glow of the cable died, and the rumbling from the obelisk resumed near inaudible levels. All 4 lizards clambered back down from the chair, leaving the woman to slump forward. A thick trail of steaming black sludge leaking from the gaping, blistered, and empty hole in her skull. "You bastards!" Steve roared, pulling harder than ever against the chains. "You fucking bastards! You fucking try that with me, I'll kill you, you hear me? I'll fucking..." Steve was interrupted not by a sound, but by light. More specifically, by light leaving. Without warning, the purple orbs hanging from the ceiling went out. The chamber was plunged into near total darkness, lit only by the faint dials and displays of the strange machines, and the disconcerting orange-blue glow from the rumbling crystal boulder. I may not have understood the lizards' words as they started yelling at each other, but I understood the tones. Confusion, worry, concern, whatever they'd expected to happen when they dragged us down here to the obelisk. This wasn't part of it. In the glow, I caught sight of the largest of the yellow-slashed guards barking untranslatable orders as his shorter comrades ran around. The jaundiced frog lizards were scurrying more frantically around their beeping machines than they'd been doing, more haphazardly, clumsily. I heard Steve yell something, but his words were drowned out by the deep, booming explosions now coming from the tunnels behind us.